This is the Content Strategy Insights Podcast, episode number 175. Throughout our days, we are all taking note of things for a variety of reasons in a number of ways. A to-do list on your computer, a scribble in the margin of a book, a blog post idea in a Google Doc. In his new book, Duly Noted, Jorge Arango sets out principles and practices to create a digital note-taking regimen, and then shows you how to connect and cultivate your notes in a personal knowledge garden where you can gather your thoughts and harvest insights.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights Podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 175 of the Content Strategy Insights Podcast. I am really delighted today to welcome to the show Jorge Arango. Jorge is an independent information architect. He's an author, he's an educator, and I asked him on the show today to talk about his new book, Duly Noted. So welcome, Jorge. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Hey, Larry, thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. And as you have noted, I have a new book called Duly Noted, and I'm excited about that. As you also mentioned, I'm an information architect. That's what I do for a living, and I have been doing that for a long time. And what gets me out of bed these days is the fact that we have access to all this information in the world, right? And those of us who work in this space have been part of making it possible for there to be more information in the world than there's ever been before, right? And that's a good thing, and it can also be a bad thing. And I'm very focused on the good. Like, let's make it good, right? So that's what gets me motivated, and we can talk more about what that means in the context of this book.
And I say, well, that leads to one of the, as I read the book, it's a fantastic book and everybody should get it. But one of the things that struck me as I read it, especially as I got deeper into it and you started talking about how to structure things and organize and metadata and all that stuff. And I'm like, okay, this guy's an information architect. I wonder if like a sales executive or a CEO had had similar insights and written a book, if it would have been different. Or so do you feel like these are like kind of universal, like not truths, but like insights that you've discovered? Or do you feel like your background as an information architect, how do you think that informed the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe to give folks a bit of background, folks might not know what we're talking about here. The book is called Duly Noted because it's basically about note-taking. And you might ask yourself, was like, what? Really a whole book about notes? I mean, notes are something that I think a lot of us take for granted. We've been doing it for a long time. I've been doing it since I was a kid in school, right? And I think a lot of people started taking notes like that. In my case, I remember in the late 70s and early 80s using a trapper keeper to, these big 3-ring plastic binders to keep loose leaf notes. So it's one of those things where it's like we can take it for granted, and yet they have tremendous power. And this book is about how to take better notes. But not just any kind of notes. It's specifically about using digital tools to take better notes and focusing on what is different about digital. So digital is different than those trapper keepers that I used when I was in school, right? And it has some capabilities and some constraints, and we have to understand digital as a medium if we want to make good use of this. And the question, like, knowing that as a background, then you might reframe the question as like, why is an information architect writing about note-taking somehow? And the way that I came to this subject is that I have been taking notes for a long time. Like I said, I started in school, but then in work, I would do things like take notes about what was happening in meetings, for example, meeting minutes, right? Like a lot of people do that. And I've been doing that for a long time. And I started taking that kind of notes in paper, much like I did with the school notes. And eventually I moved over to doing it with a computer. And I had this realization that there were things about doing this with a computer that were different than doing it on paper. And moreover, there were similarities between some of the things that I needed to do to make information more useful when I was taking notes from what I was doing to make information more useful for other people as an information architect, right? So in some ways, my career as an information architect is about making information easier to access, more findable, more understandable for other people. And this is about doing the same thing, but for myself, for yourself, right? So there's quite an affinity there. And I had written a book prior to this one called Living in Information, which is about building, designing and building digital systems, which I called in the book information environments, that better honor people's attention, that allow us to think better using these digital spaces. But it was written for designers, for people who are information architects or user experience designers, that sort of thing. And this book, this new book, I see kind of as a complement to that, but rather than being addressed to the people who are designing digital systems, it's more addressed at the users of digital information, people in every walk of life who are interacting with information, perhaps knowledge workers, students, authors, teachers, anyone whose work revolves around knowledge and working with information can benefit from knowing a little bit of information architecture. And that's what this book tries to do. It tries to bring principles and practices from the world of information architecture to managing your own stuff.
Nice. The whole intent of this podcast is to democratize content strategy practice, and sounds like we're very aligned on that. It also resonates. I had Abby Covert on a few months ago, and she was talking specifically about democratizing information architecture. So there's some kind of a plot happening here to get these practices and principles out to more folks. I love that. One thing is you were talking about the history of your own personal history of note taking. I was thinking about one of the things that you do really well in the book. Like I had never really thought about how many different kinds of notes there are, and you kind of go everything from like to-do lists hanging on a sticky on the refrigerator to like class notes or all those things in between. Tell me a little bit about like the scope of intent of note taking and how you kind of focus it into this digital realm that you're focusing on in the book.
One of the challenges with the word notes is that it's one of those words that we use to refer to a bunch of different things, right? And when you start thinking about it, we talk about, let's say something like a sticky note, right? That's a very common note type, right? Like when you say notes, many of the people listening in might have thought of sticky notes first. It's a very common use for notes. We also use the word notes to refer to the sort of things that we write down when we're capturing meeting minutes. We use the word notes to refer to the marginalia that we capture when we're reading a Kindle book. For example, we will highlight certain passages and maybe make notes with the highlight. And we call all those things notes, but if you think about them, they are very different, both in intent and in form. And one of the first steps in making better use of notes as a means for thinking better, which is ultimately what this book is about, is to acknowledge and recognize that when we say notes, we mean different things. And doing this little kind of taxonomy of different note types is a way to help readers be more intentional about what they use and for what ends, right? So if you're going to do brainstorming, for example, you might benefit from sitting down with a very large sheet of paper and maybe some colored markers. And you can do something like a mind map or kind of a brain dump on the page, right? Whereas if you're trying to make a list of things that you need to buy at the grocery store, that's not going to be well served by a large sheet of paper with colored pens, right? So just knowing what you're trying to do and what part of your cognitive abilities you're trying to augment, and then knowing what note types are available to you can help you be more intentional about this stuff and therefore think better.
Yeah, and I love that the whole intent of it being to augment human intelligence. But I think that's really coming to the fore with AI getting so prominent. But it's an old concept. I love that Howard Rheingold invoked Doug Engelbart's name in the in the intro to the book. And for people who don't know who Doug Engelbart, I think was he the first person that talks explicitly and specifically about using digital tools to augment human knowledge?
Well, he was very early. There were precedents. I think, well, Vannevar Bush didn't talk specifically about digital stuff, right? But he was talking about something that was kind of like a proto hypertext type system, right? And Engelbart, my impression is that one of his main contributions is that he actually built a prototype of such a system, right? So it wasn't just about talking about this stuff, it was about embodying these principles, bringing them to life in an actual functioning system, which was obviously very influential. And yes, you mentioned Howard Rheingold. That was just for context here as well. I was I feel very privileged to have had Howard write a what I consider to be a fabulous foreword to the book. And Howard wrote a book which was very influential to me called Tools for Thought, which traced the history of computers as a mind augmentation technology, right? Starting way back in the late 19th century with people like Charles Babbage and Lady Lovelace, right? And uh, and this book just traces Howard's book in this case traces the history of computers as a mind augmentation technology, and to me that is one of the motivating factors behind doing this work. In that, I find the idea that there are technologies that can augment our cognitive abilities. I find it tremendously exciting because I'm just kind of a regular person. I have a below, what I consider to be like a below average memory. And I have experienced in myself just the having the ability to write down things and to keep track of ideas to be incredibly empowering and to allow me to do things that I would not have been able to do had I not been able to extend my cognitive abilities with things out in the environment, including computers. So I consider that to be central to this project.
Yeah, and that notion of augmenting both like your just human activities in general, but especially the memory part of it. That's like, I guess that kind of gets at the main, like the overarching intent of any note is to like help you remember something. But one of the things I love about the book is that okay, that's step one. And then you have this whole garden that you cultivate to do something with those ideas. And so I assume the higher intent is that what you talk about, like sparking insights and harvesting ideas down the road. Can you talk about a bit about that knowledge garden metaphor that you use in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. The central metaphor in the book is that what I am inviting the reader to build or to consider building is what I'm calling in the book a personal knowledge garden. And this is a metaphor that has, pardon the pun, it has kind of long roots in the in the field. I did an interview with Mark Bernstein, the designer of Tinderbox, a hypertext note-taking app, and a long time contributor to the hypertext community, where he mentioned that the metaphor has very early uses in Xerox PARC in the 1970s. I think Kathy Marshall was a researcher he cited, talking about this kind of agricultural metaphor or botanical metaphor. And the idea here is that you think of building for yourself a space, a metaphorical space, where you can go to do work. And again, I'm talking completely metaphorically, right? Like this is not a physical space you go to. It's a place that you go to in your mind where you can feel at ease that you are keeping ideas. And The reason why I gravitated to this gardening metaphor is twofold. One is the notion that that a garden is something that grows over time. It's not something that you do overnight, right? It's something that requires work. It requires patience. It requires elbow grease. It requires commitment, right? And a certain degree of love to do. And it's something that brings you pleasure. It's not just work. It's something that if you're into it, it really gives you meaning, and it's fulfilling, right? It's an activity that nurtures you more than by producing like actual fruit. Um, so that's one reason. The other origin, at least for me, is it came through something that I read by Brian Eno, the musician and record producer. And he made a distinction between architecture and gardening. And and as you might imagine, as an information architect and someone who was educated as an architect, that resonated with me, right? And he said that the distinction that he drew there was that architecture can be thought of as kind of a top-down activity where you are defining structures, and those structures then get built. And once they're built, they're kind of there, right? So you have to do a lot of thinking up front about the form that the thing is going to take, and you have to do the structuring a bit up front. And he contrasted that kind of creative work with the work of a gardener, where the gardener also has some structures that they put up front, but the intent is not to have those structures reflect the final vision of the thing. Instead, those structures are there to enable the growth of these organic artifacts or these organic things that are the real form of the place, right? And the gardener doesn't so much design and build the place as nurture it into being somehow. And the gardener stewards the place, right? It's not the sort of work that we do as architects where we're defining the thing up front and then putting it into the world. It's more we are creating these structures that are there to encourage a certain growth, a certain emergent structure, certain um, bottom-up forms, right? And I think that that's a more appropriate way to think about these knowledge spaces than the sort of work that I do as an information architect, which does entail thinking up front about the structures that will allow people to find stuff.
Hmm. It's interesting. It's still, as you say that, there's still room for architecture in this because, like, even if you're just building the lattice work for a garden or for a feature in a garden, that's still, but it's like, it's not like to hang art on the wall. It's like to have this organic thing unfold there instead. I love that. That seems like a more, and it seems like a more realistic way when you think about how the world actually operates. It seems like, I don't know, that like when you're actually trained as an architect, which I wonder what percentage of information architects have that background.
I know a few of them, particularly people of my vintage who started in this field before this was something that you could study in university, right? So there's obviously a lot of folks with different backgrounds, but architecture, yeah, I've met a few.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think, and when you think about it, but when you think about yeah, just that notion of architecture to facilitate, cultivation and nourishing and nurturing and all that versus like just a place to put stuff. It seems it's an important distinction. I think that's really interesting, especially in the context of note taking, because you're like, is each note like I'm going to probably go way too far with this. Like, is it seeds or is it tell me a little bit about how how you put the note taking schemes and systems and practices that you advocate into that garden metaphor.
Well, I mean, the metaphor is a metaphor, right? And one has to be careful with metaphors because one can end up constraining themselves too much if you know, try to overfit the work into the metaphor. Um, but There are parallels here. You mentioned the idea of a seed, right? And I know at least one person, Maggie Appleton, who has a website where she publishes her garden. And there are people who publish their knowledge gardens. They're called digital gardens. You can Google that phrase and find a bunch of them. One of my favorites is Maggie Appleton's. And one of the reasons that I like Maggie's is that I think it does a really good job of balancing this kind of emergent bottom-up structure stuff with something that is navigable by people like myself who are not the builders of the place, right? One of the challenges with making this kind of thing public is that if you're doing it for yourself, the structure of the place is going to be highly idiosyncratic, and it's not, by definition, it's not going to be as accessible to third parties as something that is intentionally designed to be usable by a lot of people. But Maggie's garden is interesting because it does have a structural design that makes it possible for you as a visitor to navigate it and to find value there. And one of the things she does is she has a taxonomy of for tagging posts that marks the stage of the idea in its lifespan, going from, I forget the terms, what it's like, going from seedling to, from something that has sprouted, quote unquote,
Yeah.
and something that is more developed, right? So that you can get a sense, you can get a read on how thought through these ideas are. Because this is the thing. These are thinking spaces. These are not spaces. I don't think of them primarily as publications. I think of them primarily as notebooks in the sense that you are doing thinking work there, right? Thinking work I think of as different than publishing work. They are clearly related, but you do a different kind of thinking when you are just trying to think about what something is or what it means or what you think about it than when you are trying to put something out into the world that is meant to be sold or consumed or educate people, for example, right? So they are slightly different. And I'm talking here about the former, right? So it's really interesting to see someone who is doing that thinking in public and kind of acknowledging like this idea is kind of not fully grown yet. Like let's just tag it as a seedling.
And I love that she has like a taxonomy for the stage that something that I love that you invoked Maggie's name too, because she first came to my attention. And this is where I'm going to just ham-handedly turn this back to content strategy a little bit. But she first came to my attention as she was working on this block protocol format thing, because we're kind of like, it's still, especially on the web. And this is one of the things you talk about in the book is about the structure of notes and how to organize them and attach metadata to them, for figuring out, how they relate to one another. But in terms of like another way to think about that is like that block thing. And blocks are, I don't know, there's no set definition of it, but it's like you have a document on like a web page or something, and then there are parts of it. And one of those ways to label those parts is a block. And so that's how Maggie first came to my thing. And she was super thoughtful about that. And I'm just wondering, like, that sort of like this notion of lattice works and gardens and chunks of meaningful chunks of things, like how that all comes together. And then when you're talking about the intent of like a notebook to document and augment your thinking versus a publication for sharing with folks, that there's a lot going on in there.
There is, yeah, and I think you're right to relate this to content strategy because there are a lot of similarities there. One of the challenges that we face as people trying to navigate what has become a really complex information environment is that we are experiencing information through mental models that have been formed by pre-digital media. And we are dealing with digital information and we are inhabiting environments that are kind of shaped by digital information. And you referred casually to metadata, but metadata is a good example of what I'm talking about here. I think that most people who started thinking with notes, like I did with paper, had not paid a lot of attention to metadata, right? Metadata is not something that is inherent to thinking on paper. Now, it's not to say that there isn't metadata there. I mean, the one that comes to mind are page numbers and indices in books, right? Which
Mhm.
are a fairly late invention, as far as I know, into the codex, the book form, right? There were, books were around for a long time before someone had the idea to put numbers on pages so that you could randomly access information in the book. But when I was using Trapper Keepers as a kid, I wasn't thinking, is there something that can describe this beyond thinking, hey, this loose leaf goes in this particular subject in the binder, right? Like this is, I don't know, this class was about science or about social studies or about what have you, right? But I wasn't thinking too much about metadata, and I think that what's happened, and this is part of the reason why I wrote the book, is that we need different mental models to make good use out of the tools that we have now, the capabilities that digital brings to the table.
Mm.
And if you look at note-taking tools, I was about to say something kind of profoundly unfair. There have been incredibly powerful tools for a long time. Uh, One that immediately, well, you already mentioned Doug Engelbart's system. There's the work that Ted Nelson did on Xanadu, right, which was, I think, more conceptual than realized. I know that there are prototypes of that, but it's not something you can easily use, right? Uh, but then, in the 80s, we had HyperCard. I've already referenced Tinderbox, Mr. Bernstein. That tool has been around for over 20 years. And these are all tools that I think make good use of what is really special about digital as a set of thinking technologies. The problem is that using those tools requires different mental models, like I was saying. And so the tools that have become most popular for taking digital notes are tools that mimic the capabilities of paper-based systems. So I'm thinking of like I would think that among the most popular of these is Apple Notes, the tool that comes with the app that comes with iPhones, right? Or in the Android space, it's something like Google Keep. And both of those are fairly capable tools, but they are designed, I think, primarily to be understandable by people who are used to thinking of notes as things that live in notebooks, perhaps in folders, right? Like they have this very kind of hierarchical structure, and they make links between nodes second-class citizens of some kind. Like I believe that well, I know for a fact that Apple Notes has links, and I think that Google Keep does as well. I don't use Google Keep, but I think both of those tools have the capability of adding links, but it's fairly difficult to do so, right? And just to give an example, um, I know that Apple Notes has tags, but that's a fairly recent development. But for the most part, these are tools that are meant to be used by a lot of people and therefore leverage kind of pre-digital metaphors very heavily. And what's happened now over the last few years, I would say over the last 5 years or so, is that there have been a slew of new tools coming to market that are really kind of digitally native. And they make creating, I'm going to use the phrase hypertext note-taking systems, which is that kind of highfalutin phrase, but they make it possible to take these kind of digitally native notes uh, in a way that is kind of fairly easy to get into if you understand a few basic principles, right?
Mm.
And I'm talking about tools like I guess the best known is Notion, but there's also Rome Research, Obsidian, Lobseq. There's a bunch of them. And and these tools don't they kind of jettison paper notebook metaphor in favor of something that is much more, I think, authentic to the digital medium. And they're incredibly powerful if you understand what digital note-taking can do and what digital media is good at. So the intent in one of the intents in Duly Noted is to teach you these basic principles. It's like, what is the mental model you need to actually use these digital tools to think better?
Yeah, and that's amazingly helpful. And I think it's interesting because I was going to ask you as you were talking a minute ago about like, yeah, how do you make that leap? How do you get out of those pre-digital mental models? And it's exactly those tools. These are developers who are living just a little bit in the future, compared to where most of us are, and helping us see that. Yeah, because I think Obsidian in particular, it comes the closest. You invoked Ted Nelson's name. It kind of has transclusion in it. It has all kinds of linking capabilities and all those things that Ted was talking about, like what, 40 or 50 years ago. Hey, Jorge, I can't believe we're coming up close to time. These conversations always go way too quick. But before we wrap, I want to make sure, is there anything that's come up in the conversation that you'd like to revisit, or that you just want to make sure we share before we go?
No, I mean, you've been super generous with your time already. This is great. I do think that the shout out to the relationship between this stuff and content strategy is really important. And I think that folks who understand content, how to structure content to make it scalable and to allow people to, I'm gonna try to call it out, to give folks who are creating content the flexibility to create the content that a system needs in order to communicate, while also imposing some degree of coherence and consistency, are going to be able to very easily get into it because you already have a big part of this mental model in place, right? Like you understand metadata, you understand things like tagging and linking and the role that they play. It's just taking those mental models and then applying them to this other domain, which has to do with your own personal information. You're designing not for an audience of customers, patients, users, whatever you call the users in your particular domain. You're designing it for an audience of you, which is you of the future, right? Like the person that you're going to be 5 years from now when you encounter this idea or whatever. And many of the same principles apply. It's just a slightly different audience.
Yeah, no, I love that you of the future. I think about it all the time. Every time I find a little post that I left for myself and go like, oh, thank you. Yeah, but I also more, and I'm just thinking out loud here a little bit, but I feel like this garden-y thing is way more appropriate to modern content ecosystems, which are more like gardens and are way more iterative and organic, and there's a lot of emergent strategy coming out of things you discover. All of that stuff seems really amenable to and will be well supported by the insights in your book. So thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, that's the intent. This is emergent structure that we're talking about, and it's structure that hopefully helps you think better. That's the whole point.
Yep, appreciate that. Oh, hey, one very last thing, Jorge. What's the best way if folks want to connect or follow you online? What's the best way to reach out?
The best place to find me is my website, which is jarango.com. So Jarango. Jarango. I need to make sure I pronounce that right. .com. And then if you want to learn more about the book, it's dulynoted.fyi. So it's the name of the book, .fyi. And I just wanted to let you know that if you buy the book from our friends at Rosenfeld Media, the publisher, they are extending a discount code for listeners of this show. And the code is ContentPod. And that will get you 20% off the price of the book.
Thanks so much for that, and thanks for the great conversation, Jorge. I'll put all that information in the show notes as well, and we'll time the launch of the discount code so that it lasts. We'll time it to drop just about the same time as the podcast. So
yeah, I should have said it. It's for that discount code is going to work for a limited time, so you want to make sure that you use it up.
Cool. Well, we'll get it in there for sure. Thank you so much, Jorge. This was a fun conversation.
Larry, this has been lovely. Thank you for hosting me.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.